Under the law, every man between the ages of 16 and 60 was a member of the town militia, or a member of a different militia group. Boston had several militia groups, the Corps of Cadets, the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company, and other militia groups. Each group was somewhat informally organized. The men would elect their officers. Often the officer would recruit men to join his particular militia company. John Hancock was the commander of the First Corps of Cadets, elected by the men, and of course Hancock, being one of the wealthiest men in town, could afford to uniform his men. The men, though, would be responsible for their own equipment, maintaining their equipment, and every year they would meet and elect their officers. The annual militia election was a big event in any town where the men would get together and they would do a little bit of training and would fire their weapons. During wartime, of course, things become much more serious, and in the 1750s and 60s, many of the men in the militias had fought in the 7 Years' War. However, they had fought somewhat differently from the way the English fought. The men in the militia would build a camp where they wanted to, and you would pitch a tent next to one of your friends. There was no real order to the camp. There might be an informal order if you knew the town from which these men came. Much different from an English camp. And if you went into an English camp, you immediately knew where was the commanding officer's tent. It was the biggest, and it was usually at the center. And then the men's tent would be on the periphery, and the men would be carefully organized with their commander, their sergeant, their corporal, their captain, and so on, leading in a hierarchical way toward the tent of the general. In an American militia camp, the men would pitch their tents. You might want to be under a tree. You would definitely want to be upstream from other men. Much less formal, much less organized. The men would supply themselves when they were in actual service. They would expect to be paid by the provincial government. They're not being underwritten by the empire, unless, of course, they're in the service of the empire. And they would communicate with other militias somewhat informally. It would be through their officers or through the men themselves. And if one officer died, he might not necessarily be replaced by the second in command. Instead, the men might elect someone else. So the militia was formed for the purpose of defense, not as a long-term military unit. And the very idea of having a long-term military unit was treated with suspicion. You would not want to have a standing army. The men in the colonies, men and women in the colonies, understood standing armies to be dangerous to liberty. And the men in these militia camps also would be somewhat resistant to taking orders and accepting discipline from officers whom they had elected. You're certainly not going to elect someone who's going to have you put in the stockade for doing something which to you might seem perfectly normal or reasonable. So the colonists, though, regarded the militia, it was their duty, and it was their unit. The British regarded the militia with a great deal of scorn. These were just collections of rabble. They were armed mobs. And certainly, if there were any conflict between the troops of the British Empire, the disciplined professional fighting force, and these rabble in arms, it wouldn't be much of a contest. It would be over quite quickly.